Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. Today we were supposed to discuss the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and the impact that polluted and toxic water has on marginalized communities, as well as both the short-term and long-term ramifications this leaves behind. But first, we must talk about the uprising in Minnesota. Yesterday, we had Ayan, who was at the scene in the protests, talking about her signals were being jammed and she wasn't able to share some of what her feelings were and the community on the ground over there were feeling. And we had Marjorie Hill the day before talking about anti-racism and what, the hard work that it takes in anti-racism education. But as we were getting ready for this show, we've been pushing for people to call Mike Freeman and for the arrest of this police officer. And just breaking news has come in that the former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, has been arrested for the death of George Floyd. Some are seeing this as a victory, but the remaining 3 officers who were on the scene people are asking for them to also be held accountable for their involvement in this brutal murder. Stepping back a little bit, because the Flint water crisis, this is all a systematic. This is all the same monster, just different ugly faces. The fact that activists have been working on Flint for many, many years. It's the Flint water crisis in Michigan is a public health crisis that started in 2014 after the drinking water source for the city of Flint, Michigan was changed. In April 2014, Flint changed its water source from being treated by the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department to a source that was taken from Lake Huron and the Detroit River to the Flint River. Officials failed to apply corrosion inhibitors to the water. As a result, lead from aging pipes leached into the water supply, leading to extremely elevated levels of heavy metal neurotoxins and exposing over 100,000 residents to elevated lead levels. A pair of scientific studies proved that lead contamination was present in the water supply. So today, to discuss all of these various issues and to also discuss activism in the Muslim community, our sacred duty towards activism and its place in Islam, and the appropriate methods by which we as Muslims should be navigating through social justice issues based on Islamic principles. My guest today is Dawud Walid. Imam Dawud is currently the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council of American-Islamic Relations, CAIR Michigan, which is the largest advocacy and civil liberties organization for American Muslims. And he's also a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council, Imams Committee. Brother Dawud is the author of Towards Sacred Activism, a book that discusses and attempts to provide concise, general guidance to Muslims in the West regarding engagement in social justice activism from an Islamic perspective. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for being here, Brother Dawud.
Wayak.
So, it's been just a heavy Ramadan, and Eid was definitely a very different Eid. And just following up on that, there was a brother on May 9th, a Sudani brother who was killed by the police after he was having a mental health crisis. Then Breonna Taylor, a young woman, was killed by police in her home. And then we get this awful footage of a man, a brother, 46 years old, George Floyd, in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, who was killed by police officers. So it's a heavy topic, but when we were so grateful that you were already coming on the show to talk about Flint, and so now you can help us contextualize what is happening in Minneapolis currently.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathiran da'iman abada. First of all, let me say to you, Sister Hena, thanks for inviting me on to have this conversation with you. And may Allah protect you and your family and all of those of you and all of those whom you love, and protect the ummah of the Prophet alayhi salam. Well, in regards to these latest events that have taken place that you mentioned, 3 names in particular, the only thing in my mind that's really changed or elevated some of these conversations right now, as they did a few years back in relationship to Eric Gardner, who was choked out by the NYPD, or Mike Brown in Ferguson, is now we just simply have these things. We have these cameras and as well as social media to help spread this news. But from my vantage point, these situations really haven't increased over the years. I can think about in 1999 when Ahmadou Diallo, was mispronounced Diallo, Ahmadou Diallo, Muslim, who's an immigrant from Guinea, who was murdered by the NYPD back in 1999. Our beloved Imam Siraj Wahaj, may Allah preserve him, did that janazah prayer. 1992 here in Detroit with the Malice Green murder by the Detroit Police Department. And going back further to when I was a kid, and when my father was here in Detroit during the 1967 uprising, where Black men got killed by the Detroit police, and going back even further into the history of America in so many different cities. This has never stopped, right? So I just suggest to the readers, number one, that we look at this in the continuum of history and not try to isolate it as some sort of new strange phenomenon. In fact, I would say that what's going on right now is actually a very American phenomenon in the arc or in the continuum of American society, number one. Number two is that these issues we look at are all connected in terms of the institutionalized racism in the United States of America and the false ideology of white supremacy, which undergirds America, expresses itself in many ways. It expresses itself in such ways of, like, how, for instance, Michigan is only 12% Black, but we have about half of the COVID-19 deaths in Michigan or Black folks. So it relates to access to health care, people being sent home, ventilators being given to some people and not to others. It goes to the issue of how certain communities are policed, where we know that people based upon ethnicity use drugs and sell drugs in proportion to their demographics in society. The majority of people who use drugs and sell illicit drugs in America are white, yet we see disproportionate incarceration and mass incarceration of African-American males relating to drug use, right? The same thing with the percentage of how Black men are no less than 4 times more likely to be fatally killed, unarmed, by police, actually 5 out of 10, I believe, in comparison to someone who's non-Black, and particularly white people in America. And the list goes on and on. The issue relating to Flint and people turning a blind eye in government. When General Motors reported to the state government at the time, led by Republican Governor Snyder, that the water they were using for Flint to test the engines literally was corroding the engines. And so they knew what this water would be doing to human bodies when it was actually corroding and messing up car engines that were being tested in the GM plant, right? So, but we know the demographics of Flint as well, and being a majority Black city. So all of these different things that we see going on from Minnesota and Minneapolis right now, going down to Ahmed Arbery being hunted like an animal south of the Mason-Dixon line. This happens in the north and the south. What's taking place in Flint? It's still taking place in Flint right now, as far as the water still being highly suspect and questionable to drink. Mass incarceration, lack of proper health care, the lack of access to proper education within certain zip codes. All of these different things are interconnected, and they're rooted in the false ideology of white supremacy that permeates basically every aspect of American life, which includes culture and education, right? So we shouldn't look at these things as something that's isolated from one from the other. They are all interconnected.
So we see these, interconnected, and it applies to housing, infrastructure, jobs, but okay. So imagine someone who has read a really whitewashed history of the United States, right? And they don't know any of this. What would your advice be to someone, for example, who might be thinking of immigrating here, or who has immigrated here? Talk to the immigrant community, because I believe a lot of immigrants need to understand the history. They need to, and obviously we don't have time to go into a historical, but resources that we can share with them that would put all of this in perspective, so they understand that what is happening right now in Minneapolis is not rioting. It's a regime that has been oppressing people, just like we see uprisings across the world. And we side with the people because we see, and sometimes, when I'm having these discussions with my own community, the things that come back is, and you realize how much misinformation, miseducation of people there is. And so, yeah, if I could get a comment on that.
Okay, well, there's so many works that could be read in regards to this issue. I would recommend a couple very briefly, and then just take a step back into history. And I think that this is very instructive and important for people who are immigrants who immigrate to the United States of America, and they feel like they've reached some sort of the American dream regarding socioeconomically, and they came here with nothing, and don't understand why certain other groups don't have what they have, and maybe if they just work harder, they could have it. So I will go into that very briefly. But the first two books, if there's some somewhat light reads, I mean, they're dense in information, but not huge books as far as a reading. One would be The New Jim Crow by Professor Michelle Alexander, who is a law professor and a constitutional law expert. So The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that would has a lot of historical information and talk about the issue of mass incarceration. And then another one, which is somewhat of an older book, would be Race Matters by Dr. Cornell West. So I would recommend both of those books to be read for the audience. Perhaps Dr. West's book may be a first read before Professor Alexander's work on this subject. But now going back, America was established upon a very clear racial hierarchy, right? And this racial hierarchy has morphed over time, and there has been, and there is still a de facto racial hierarchy that's operating in the United States of America right now, with whiteness being at the top and blackness being at the bottom, along with Native Americans. And then there's different shades in the middle. And I don't like this term people of color, because it gives the false impression that that everyone is equal within the hierarchy because they're non-white. No, there are different grades within this hierarchy, and some people who have been used or as wedge racists in the United States of America, and actually have been used unknowingly, perhaps, to help suppress those people who've always been historically at the bottom. So the indigenous people of this land got their land stolen. Over 90% of them ethnically cleansed from this land. And then enslaved Africans, up to 30% of them Muslims, were brought here and treated like chattel, worse than animals, worked to death, and even written into the initial United States Constitution as constituting 3/5 of a person. And this relates to electoral votes for the states. And the Declaration of Independence author Thomas Jefferson is actually the architect of this evil 3/5 clause. By the way, the man who wrote "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." That individual. So there's always been a racial hierarchy and whiteness at the top. Now this whiteness has shifted over time to the point that when Irish people were first brought here as indentured servants and then were able to immigrate here freely, and this is, we can see this during the famous potato blight in Ireland, there was a white box and an Irish box where Irish people were considered fully white, though they weren't down at the bottom that were black. But eventually Irish people and their religion, Catholicism, later on got absorbed into the broader paradigm of what it means to be white. Now, different immigrant groups were able to come to America, and more so after the Immigration Act of 1965, which was the door was opened to that by the Civil Rights Act of 64, the struggle for by African Americans to allow people from South Asia, allow people from the so-called Middle East to come here to the United States of America. And there were certain visas that were given a certain level of allowances for the United States of America relating to education and also to fill certain job slots here in the United States of America. But yet individuals weren't treated fully as white. And the vast majority of immigrants who came after that time came here for the American dream, right? And the American dream historically for immigrants is they have a white house with a white picket fence. And normally this means living in a so-called Gora neighborhood or living next to white folks, right? So there's a implicit system set up that in order to get the American dream, the antithesis of whiteness in America is blackness, right? It then brings about a type of distancing from black people. And really immigrants that came here really weren't concerned about civil rights and fighting for civil rights in general. And really, it's really been a post 9/11 phenomenon, and with Islamophobia, where many people from immigrant background began to get their foot, the foot of the false ideology of white supremacy on their necks, when all of a sudden, you know, talking about Islamophobia and xenophobia now becoming in vogue topic. But when it was going on to black folks and the Native Americans, well, you know, it's too bad, but you know, let's go on with our lives. We don't want to get involved in politics, brother. You know, so that's part of the narrative of our community. We have to be honest about it if we are going to improve as a community. We made a lot of mistakes, but you know what? Allah Azza wa Jal, He is a Rahim. He's a merciful Redeemer. We can be redeemed. We can do better. There's a lot of khair in the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we could do better. But in order to do better, we have to acknowledge our past mistakes so that we can do islah. We have to rectify those mistakes of the past that we've been involved in, and we're still making some mistakes, right? We're still making mistakes, but we have to do reform.
And you're so right. There's so much unlearning to do, because I can just tell you from my own experience, even though, you know, I tell people this, well, I grew up in an African country. I grew up in the Sudan. But our history books were American textbooks taught in an American private school. And just coming to the United States to go to university or college, and then, you know, seeing just an opposite. And and places like inner city Boston or New Orleans, and and when you're told by your roommates that, oh, there's a white side of the lake and there's a black side of the lake, and just that shock, just what, like, it was, I can understand that people, there's this cognitive dissonance and people don't get it. They're like, but that's not what it's like in the movies, and this is, or the movies will tell you that these are the people that you hate and these are the people that you're supposed to love. So yes, and so to our audience, whoever's listening in, it's okay to be misinformed, but it's not okay to say misinformed. You have to unlearn what you were taught. You have to do that hard work. If you want to, a lot of us, we work for a lot of issues and we see the injustices everywhere else in the world, except when it comes to our own backyards. We don't want to look at it as an injustice. So what is happening right now in Minneapolis, is that a riot or is that an uprising?
That is definitely mass mobilization where people are trying to stand up for their human rights. Mm-hmm. And even though there has been some looting, which, by the way, a lot of that looting that's going on is not going on by Black people and people coming outside of from outside areas who don't even reside in the zip codes in that area. Similar to Ferguson, that we know this. There's video floating around about a white guy knocking out windows and things like that. But this is an overall mobilization of people, basically of the proverbial straw breaking the camel's back, where people just can't take this stuff over and over and all these indignations. And what's going on in Minneapolis is about Mr. George Floyd, but it's much bigger than Mr. George Floyd. It's about centuries of this stuff going on. It's about when people see the disparities. It's about when they see that a Somali police officer in Minneapolis shoots a white woman by accident, he immediately gets arrested and gets the book thrown at him. But then when we see other things like where this one guy, and these other 3 people should be arrested and charged, by the way, that they get fired and get to sit home in their homes and have dozens and dozens of police protection, right? And then the historical arc of the system is on this guy's side. Like, people know this when they go outside and protest in the streets. Well, at least Black folks know about this, right? So this isn't. It can't be reduced simply to just, oh, well, there's some people, if they only behaved well, then maybe this wouldn't happen. Well, people behave well all the time. Philando Castile, who was murdered a couple of years ago in Minneapolis, in that area, in Minnesota, with his fiance and with his child, with a license permit, was following the law to the T and told the police that he had a gun legally in his car, and he was murdered, right? And so he was following the law. So it's this whole situation of the media and some people actually trying to criminalize Black bodies or criminalize victims, and taking the focus not only off of the killers, but take the focus off of the environment and the historical injustices that would lead people to mass mobilize and go out in the streets to begin with, right? And that's the bigger piece that we as Muslims who aren't African American. Of course, I'm an African American, but those of you who are Muslims who aren't African American, that's the bigger picture that needs to be looked at, not just on the surface, but the deeper reality. And we are told this in our deen anyway. لِكُلِّ حَقٍ حَقِيقَةٌ. Like, for every outward truth, there's a deeper reality, right? So we just can't be. The Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam aren't supposed to be superficial people. We're supposed to be superficial.
So you said something that this has been building, and then to also not put in look at it through the lens of this pandemic. Many of these people are daily wages or weekly wages workers. They haven't gotten any checks. They cannot pay their rent. They cannot buy food. And many of them have not gotten the $1,200 pity dollars that the government, they have not received their stimulus checks. So, and there are many, and as you see the footage, there are many supporters from white supporters and Latino supporters and Somali supporters who are there as well. So this is to just strip all of that and then just say that this, that this this is just natural for people to, criminals are killing, destroying property. And seriously, what is property?
Whereas the president said thugs. Yeah. That's a racialized term. That's a lower term. Thugs.
Oh, man. And then the looting and the shoot. I mean, all of that. Like, these are like dog whistles being sent out. So now people are, but so what should our response be? Let's talk about responses. So, let's talk about Black Lives Matter, the hashtag versus the organization, because a lot of times when we talk about this, people shy away sometimes from that terminology. They are very supportive of saving, and uplifting Black brothers and sisters. But so can we talk about that a little bit?
Okay, so first of all, we're people that should be primarily focused on principles. Right. So the wording of a particular action, as long as it's not using like haram or inflammatory language, is not as important as the actual principles behind what we're fighting for or what we're struggling for. And this particular issue that we're dealing with is the systemic historical brutality of law enforcement in America against Black human beings. Right. That's the broader issue. And then more directly, we're talking about the issue of Mr. George Floyd, who was murdered by the police. Right now, there needs to be a distinction made between Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, and Black Lives Matter, the 501c3, right? In this work of mobilizing around and against police brutality comes long before a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, or a 501c3. We've been working on this issue for a long time. Even CAIR Michigan was working on this issue in conjunction with the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality before there was a Black Lives Matter hashtag. Malcolm X was organizing around this issue in the 1960s. Right, this isn't a new issue. People have been organizing around this for a long time. Al Sharpton and others. So
here, I'm going to give a shout out to Prince George's County, most police county in all of the United States, and amazing work that people have been doing against police brutality here, including Maurice Salahan and others. Jonathan Hutto, so many of amazing activists here. So yes,
mashallah, brother Mari has had his feet on the streets for a long time. May Allah bless him. So we have the issue of Black Lives Matter. Actually, the hashtag didn't even start relating to police brutality. The hashtag started as a response to lack of coverage relating around the vigilante killing of George Zimmerman killing Trayvon Martin. So it didn't even start with an issue relating to police brutality. Then it became to get more credence after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson by the Ferguson police, right? And it began to be used as a rallying call or a mantra that Black Lives Matter is basically an antidote or a remedy of saying really Black lives have really never mattered as much in American society as white lives. So it's a statement of affirmation. Yes, Black lives do matter. Now the 501c3 started later. And the 501c3 Black Lives Matter at seed money, how it started, was not funded by Black people. It is outside foundations, and I know the foundations, and I'm in this world, founded certain people, and they started a nonprofit 501c3 with money not funded or money not from the Black community, from outside of the Black community, so-called progressive foundations. And in the plan of this 501c3 organization and its agenda, and under the so-called banner of intersectionality, wove in the issue of transgenderism and LGBTQ in with the systemic brutality of Black Americans, which of course those two issues are very different on a number of levels, right? But it's this type of leftist type of paradigm that then began to fund Black Lives Matter as a 501c3 organization, which then for many of us as Black Americans who are Muslims who believe in the Quran and the Sunnah and Imams really made it untenable to support that 501c3 organization. And really many people who go out in the streets and even hold Black Lives Matter signs, they don't know about the funding, or they don't know about the politics behind this. They go out there as a visceral response, as a natural reaction of going out into the streets of protesting historical injustice against their people, African-American people. I'm speaking of my people, right? They're not thinking about, who's behind this 501c3 or what are the under agendas, right? So this is why I don't point people to give donations to the 501c3 Black Lives Matter. If there's a broader protest and they are there, then that's fine. But there are other grassroots organizations, like they have, like the Minnesota bailout, for instance, in the local in Minnesota, for instance, that is helping bail out people in regards to who are not able to get bail money, and people who are locked up, right? Such as times like this while peacefully protesting. A similar thing took place in Baltimore. And I know, by the way, for a fact that the rapper Jay-Z gave money and bailed out a lot of people that were locked up in Baltimore, by the way. So there's organizations in Detroit. Detroit's, like, for a long time had the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. There's other grassroots organizations that are working that could be supported. But just in summation, Black Lives Matter as a mantra and its meaning is fine, but I stopped using the hashtag because the hashtag becomes conflated with the 501c3. And I don't think that any liberation of a people can be primarily funded and the agenda help being set by a people who aren't part of those people. Mm-hmm. And that's really what's behind Black Lives Matter. And we have to be careful as a Muslim community about running after this foundation money by these people who have agendas, who don't believe in the Quran and Sunnah at all. Like we take the money, but there's a price to pay and there's something attached. And I will also say that before you give your support to a Muslim organization, you should look at who's funding them, right? A Muslim organization, well, not a Muslim organization, an organization that's ran by Muslims, right? That supports all sorts of things. Of issues, we have to look back at the money of who's funding them. We just can't support people just because they're Muslim or because they wear a hijab. We have to do a little research, because we have people in movements that are trying to leverage and using our community to leverage themselves for their own interests that aren't in our best interests.
So what are some of the, so since, you're saying that you're not using that hashtag, what are some other supportive correct terminology? Because, and we get lost in this, and then the real systematic problems don't get addressed too. So what are some things that perhaps the community can use that shows their support, is respectful, and some of the online activism that we've seen is causing a lot of hurt and trauma to the Muslim community. I mean, to the Black community. So, you know, so can you tell us some correct ways or some beneficial ways?
Well, if it's talking about using social media, I use just the hashtag of the person's name to lift up the person's name, but I don't attach Black Lives Matter, right? That's one thing. Also, if the family has some sort of legal fund or some sort of fund to help with legal expenses and or the funeral expenses, because sometimes they can't even afford funeral expenses, right? That I also encourage people to support those types of endeavors for the funeral expenses or like the legal expenses for the person. So I think those are just some very easy, clear ways of supporting people that really aren't controversial at all. I don't think there's any room for any controversy, and I think that I don't think that anyone should really have any fundamental problem with that. And maybe some people do, but I don't see where there'd be any fundamental problem or disagreement with that, including those people who would disagree with me about supporting Black Lives Matter. I don't think that they would have a problem with that.
Okay, so now I wanted to ask you, so so you've given some money, you know, a lot of people might just give the money and be like, okay, I'm done. Like, I did my part. But have they done their part? What other things need to change? One, let's talk about the Muslim community. And then what can we do aside from this? Because so the second part will be, and I'll come back to it. So we'll talk about the Muslim community first. A lot of people have very good feelings about the police. You know, they feel like, oh, these are protectors. Like, if I had, you know, if someone broke into my home, who would I call? If my car, you know. So I want to talk about police next and policing in the United States next. So let's talk about the Muslim community first.
Okay, so we have a legal precept in Islamic sacred law, right? That if you cannot give benefit, then at least do not do harm, right? So even if you can't go out and openly support something, the least of what you do is you don't do anything that could be harmful to a group of people, right? That's the lowest common denominator, right? So part of these issues that we have inside of the Muslim community is that we have the responsibility, firstly with ourselves, and then in our family, in our circle of influence, and especially inside of our own ethnic communities, that we have to address the issue of anti-Black racism, right? And we can't act like it is something that is so foreign or it doesn't exist. You know, when I gave the khutbah in earlier this year as the Islamic Society of Baltimore, it was something that was quite interesting. I gave the khutbah and I actually mentioned the issue of the brother who was killed by the Baltimore Freddie Gray. I mentioned Freddie Gray. I didn't even know that Freddie Gray's sister was a Muslim, and she actually was there that day. The khutbah, I didn't even know it. But I mentioned this in the khutbah, and an uncle came up to me and he said, well, there's no need in talking about that issue because the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he saw the issue of racism with Bilal, so there's no need in talking about that, right? And I'm like, wow, really? Like, yeah, the issue of racism was solved in Islam, but the issue wasn't solved with Muslims, right? So we have to work on this issue of racism, and the spiritual root of racism on an individual level is the spiritual disease of kibr, of arrogance. And this is a sifa, or an attribute of Iblis. And really, Iblis is the original racist, as we are told in the Quran. He said, I'm better than him because you made me a fire, but you made him of the dirt, right? So this is the original act of racism. So we have to work on the spiritual remedies of arrogance, right? And also relates to education. So we have to do our own education, not just one time, but consistently, to dispel this misinformation and really this satanic framing of Black people being somehow not as human as other people, even if we don't see it explicitly, how certain things come out within our community. So I think this is one thing that people could do. The other thing is that being interrupters of this racism when we see it amongst our people. So I'm talking about from a proactive way, but there's also a reactive. So, and just in the Quran gives us this paradigm, right? You're proactive first, al-amr bil ma'ruf, and then you have the reaction, when nahi anil munkar. It's enjoying the good and forbidding the evil. And really, amongst Muslims, we have to have no tolerance amongst ourselves, that when we see racist things playing themselves out in the community, that we just let it go. And I'll give you a brief example. And I'll give you a local example. So one of our masajid in Michigan, they go by global sighting, right? So so when the Saudis or the Emiratis say the moon's been sighted, then they will then do Eid, and they recognize it being the first day of Shawwal. Well, this year, the ulama councils in countries like Kenya and Somalia and Eritrea, they said that they had sightings. So one masjid here in the imam actually of Pakistani background, he's like, okay, well, there was a number of people who said there were authentic sightings in the Horn of Africa. We're going to go by that. And then people in the community started saying, well, first of all, it wasn't scientifically possible, according to astronomy. But in early years, when it wasn't scientifically possible, supposedly when the Saudis and the Emiratis said they cited, there was no questioning. But then some of them said to him, and they even put on the online page on their Islamic Center, when do we start following Africans? Or we don't follow Africans right now. This is straight up anti-Black racism. Now they would say, oh, well, Bilal, and I pray behind Imam Dawud, I like him, but when it came to this type of issue, then they couldn't hide what was really inside of their hearts. And the reality of it is, these Arab in this community give more deference to the opinions. I think the opinions of Arabs are better, even though ulama in this council graduate from the University of Medina. They graduate from Al-Azhar University. Some of them are actually even more learned than the scholars in the Emirates, yet they have to go, they don't trust the ulama council in these lands. They have to trust what the Saudis and the Emiratis say, right? This is a big problem, right? And this speaks to a type of structural racism inside the Muslim community, right? And we have to address this, and we can't be bashful about it. We have our own issues, right? And I will just conclude with this, and I'm sorry for this long answer.
No, that's okay. This is exactly what we're looking for.
We want Allah's help in regards to the racism against South Asians and Arabs and Islamophobia, right? And we fight against this, and we have Justice for All here, and we support organizations like ICNA and their call for social justice, and CAIR, and we say that we're for these organizations, right? Well, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, "Atamuruna an-nasa bil-birri wa tansawna anfusakum wa antum tatluna al-kitab afala taqilun." Do you call people towards righteousness and justice, but you forget it for yourselves? Yet you recite the book. Do you not have intelligence? This is what Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran. So how do we expect the nusra of Allah Azza wa Jalla? How do we expect divine help and divine support against Islamophobia and against racism and xenophobia, against Muslims of different groups, but then we're racist against each other within our own community? And we're expecting help from Allah in this? No, that is a clear moral inconsistency. And if we want divine assistance regarding the outward adversary, we have to address the inward nonsense and the inward jahl that we have inside of our community.
So, and there's so much, like, this is what you said about, it's not just enough to yourself. Okay, you change yourself. Like, okay, I can say, okay, I'm changing myself. I try not to do this certain thing that I used to do before. I've educated myself. But that is not enough. That is the least of the iman, right? Like to think something is bad in your heart. We have to actively change starting with our own families, starting with our own dinner table, teaching our own children what to say, what not to say, what is right, what is acceptable. This is a Muslim brother or sister. Their izzah is just as much as yours. Their honor is, is as much as yours. And then to go wider, and sometimes that might be uncomfortable. That might be uncomfortable to address your mother-in-law the next time she uses a derogatory word. Or it could be, an uncle who you owe money to, and now you have to tell him, no, ammu, or no, chacha, you cannot use that. You cannot say this. We go wider. Let's stop having liquor stores in our inner cities and, take money out from the inner cities and go and live in the suburbs, cushy lives, but have nothing to do with the community where our liquor stores are, which are haram, by the way, but that's another discussion. So there's so much that we can start with one thing, but there's just, you can't, and you be interrupters. You have to, you see it in the masjid, you see it in your communities, you see it in your organizations, whether you're responsible for hiring, whether you're responsible for, how come there's, a lot of times you might be asked to speak on a topic, give up the mic, hand it over to someone else who actually knows about this, right? We see this here in DC. A lot of times even people who want to serve will come in with a very uppity, missionary sort of oh my God, I'm doing such a good blessing, I'm going to go serve. Humble yourself, please. There's just so much we could dedicate hours and hours to, things that people do wrong, even if you have the best of intentions. And when someone corrects you, it's okay.
Or when the African-American medical doctor or attorney comes and he's interested in marrying your daughter and he prays Fajr and Jama'ah every morning and he's a practicing Muslim, the only reason why you turn him away because you think his skin is too dark. That's another one.
I feel like sometimes making a list of a checklist, hello, don't do this stuff, it's just presidents of MSAs versus not, who gets to be in leadership, who gets to lead the adhan, which qari is okay to listen to, acceptable, which qira'ah is acceptable. And there's a myriad of things that need to be corrected in our community. But one thing that I really, in the context of everything that is going on over here, let's talk about policing. Let's talk about police at our masajid, policing just in general. Should Muslim businesses be calling the police over a $20 counterfeit bill? What is the relationship that the Muslim community at large, or people in power, let's not say the Muslim community, let's say people in power in the Muslim community have with police? And, what is problematic about that?
Well, Sister Hena, I like to actually be very specific about the Muslim community, actually, if I can. And this issue of policing and a relationship with police, there's a level of what is called respectability politics with this, that we want to show how really nice, patriotic Americans we are. So we want to invite the police department to our masjid. As a matter of fact, we'll invite the FBI to our masjid and have CVE, even knowing they're spying on our community, right? We'll invite these people and that people because, we want to look like the good Americans. While at the same time, and we're not talking about individual police officers, we're talking about structural violence that has come from police historically in the United States of America and law enforcement in general against Black communities and Native American communities, right? That this whole thing of respectability politics has to be questioned and looked at. And as a Muslim, if you are a Muslim and you really believe that the believers are one brotherhood and that you have empathy for everyone in the ummah, then you should have empathy for your African American brothers and sisters in Islam. That many times when law enforcement is around, we actually don't feel more safe. We actually feel less safe, right? So like myself, and just something about my background for those of you who don't know. Okay, I'm in my 40s. You know, I serve actually in the U.S. military. And I've been overseas and I've sat with the mashayikh and things of that nature. But I, as a law-abiding citizen, no criminal record, never been to prison, military veteran, graduated from university, studied and sat with mashayikh overseas. And I feel in my 40s, I feel unsafe around police officers while obeying the letter of the law. Like I don't go out breaking the law. And so that's something that people have to keep in mind regarding these relationships, that literally many of us, we feel unsafe around police officers, around law enforcement. Now, in regards to partnering with law enforcement and as it relates to the store, there's a difference about what you can do and then having discretion about what is best to do. So if someone owns a store and they feel like someone is trying to defraud them or has taken something from them, do they have the right to call the police? Yes, they have the right to call the police. Actually, if their lives are in danger, if they feel their lives are in imminent danger, should they call the police? As a store owner, yeah, you probably should call the police if you can't defend yourself. But in this calculation, especially if you're a Muslim business owner, and especially if you're in a Black neighborhood selling haram stuff, right, within your store, should you call the police when you know that by your very means of calling the police on something that's potentially petty could lead this person to be killed? Should you call the police? Probably not. Probably not. But I mean, that's a call that each individual has to make. But there's a difference between what one has the right to do and probably what one should do. Right. So that's basically my thoughts on that. But the broader point is, I think as Muslims in our businesses, are we doing business that is adding to the systemic oppression of a group of people, right? What we are selling in our stores, how are we conducting business? Are we helping cause a slow death to the community and adding on to the oppression of the community by our very presence of making money in these communities? I think that's a broader question that we need to ask ourselves.
That is, and I can share this with you with some young people, especially who already feel out of place in a lot of our masajid, and when they themselves, if they're Black, feel like they can't even have an argument on the basketball court without the police being called on them. And then their friends see this, and their friends see their parents and their parents' friends treating their friends. These young people, some of them have gotten over this baggage and are hand in glove with their Black brothers and sisters. Then you're making the masjid, the purest places, houses of Allah, a place where our children are associating that with racism and don't want to have anything to do with that. And then they go and find secular places that bring in all sorts of other ideologies, where they feel like, hey, at least here, my brother and sister, my best friend, who I love with my heart and soul, will be treated with respect and will be treated like a whole entire human being, instead of being viewed through the lens of, just through their race. SubhanAllah. So this is something that we're defiling the houses of God by bringing in our filthy racism in it. So this is something that I want people to just think about as well. And then as far as your businesses are going, it really, like, unless someone has a gun to your head and it's self-defense or something of that sort, and even, and really we need to look at our protocols in our places of business, because this is a person's life. You will lose $20. Maybe you will lose $20 every day. Maybe you will lose $20 10 times a day. And maybe a lot of us, especially for a struggling immigrant who has just come here, maybe $20 is a lot of money. But let's see if we can change that and think of that as a sadaqah for someone's life. These are your customers. You sell to them. Whatever you sell to them, you could be selling something, and just that's a lot of like problematic things that we sell. How come we're not selling vegetables and fruits and turn your liquor store into a grocery store, for goodness sakes? And these are food deserts. A lot of and there is a lot of crime in that area too. But a lot of that crime is because, again, systematic. There's no food there. People since childhood have to go into liquor stores to buy basic things to eat. And so, there was another, there's just so many layers. A suburban mosque just posted this. A wise leader was asking, what can suburban mosques do to build ties to the inner city Muslim communities and inner city, or even just like the Black community in general. Not all Black people are poor. Not all Black people live in the inner city. That's something else that we tend to, stereotype. So there's just a lot. But as far as policing goes, a lot of times we don't understand that there's lots of laws in place that are supposed to govern the police as well, but they're not followed. I know here in Maryland, there's supposed to be citizen committees that oversee the police, but those committees don't send in their reports for months and months, years. 3 years have been passing. So there are, like Brother Dawud was saying, there are organizations on the ground who are doing this work, coalitions that have been built, set up to, take away bail, to take away, really like make systematic changes that are really effective. So we really should be getting out of our bubbles and, joining these coalitions, because this is a community problem. This will help your community be safer. Community policing is a concept and it can work. It has worked in places where you don't have to pick up a phone, and people have to realize majority of the police departments in the United States are trained by the Israeli police. Just let that sink in. So if you're upset about the Israeli police and how they treat Palestinians, then you should so imagine those same tactics being used in our cities. So, we could go on, and I know we're we have to wrap up. So Jazakallah khair, Brother Dawud, for coming on. And inshallah, we didn't get to talk about Flint as in depth as I wanted to. Inshallah, once hopefully, we keep working on this and for people to really harness. So if you'd like to end with, please do. The platform is yours.
Just remember, Muslims who are watching this, that justice does not mean just us. And if we are truly seeking the countenance of Allah, and if we are seeking intervention, divine intervention into our affairs of our community, in a specific subsets of our community, in particular with our ethnocentric or national interests, then that justice cannot be limited to just us. It has to be broader, right? And that starts right here in the United States of America. And as the saying goes, charity starts at home. And if we as a Muslim community, and you as Muslims who are not African American, I believe that if you work to help solve the systemic issues that have historically plagued African Americans for centuries, then if you can work to help with that, to help solve that, then by virtue of that, you will end up helping solve your problem under this system of the false ideology of white supremacy that also informs Islamophobia, xenophobia, and that affects Muslims here, but also foreign policy abroad.
SubhanAllah. Well, Jazakallah khair for being here, and thank you all. We'll be here tomorrow with another show, and if you have suggestions or comments, please do leave them on our Facebook page for future shows. You can watch us on Muslim Network TV. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.